liberties. We were just discussing, what would George Washington do? And one of the many books out there that say Washington was a deist and hardly a man of religious faith. Janice Connell on the spirituality of George Washington when the World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live. There are certain figures in the history of the United States, particularly the Founding Fathers, who have achieved a mythic status. 2 centuries later, it's often difficult to separate legend from reality. For years, an academic battle has raged over the religious practice and beliefs of George Washington. My next guest wrote a seminal work on the subject that's now being re-released in paperback, The Spiritual Journey of George Washington, in which she explores the first president's faith in public and private. Please welcome attorney and author Janice Connell.
Hello. So
Great
lovely
to have you here after all this time.
Yes.
Now, I want to start with your sense, and I hesitate to do this because I hate when people ask me, what would Mother Angelica say? But I'm going to ask you, because you've spent so much time with General Washington and immersed in his writings, what do you think he would say, given the intransigence we're seeing here in Washington, D.C., and the inability to come to a deal, to sit around a table, to get anything done?
I think he would not be surprised. I think he'd be quite aware of the foibles of human nature. And given the fact that he was such an internal man, he operated from the depths of his soul out, he would have been involved one-on-one with those he knew were open to truth. And he'd have been explaining the value of being decent by the deeds. Isn't that a little tool we could use, being decent by your deeds?
I'll say. Now, before I came across this book, I have to say, I'd read a number of biographies of George Washington, and in most of them, he is portrayed as a deist,
yes,
and at best, a lukewarm Episcopalian, kind of a cultural Episcopalian. What did you find to break open that myth?
Oh, it's special, because I was raised with the same sort of thought. Many years ago, I was reading Morris and Commander, Western Civ. Every college student takes that course, and the only reason I was looking through the book was I had nothing else handy at the moment. And I came across George Washington and a couple of miracles he had at the Battle of the Monongahela. He had some horses shot out from under him. He had 4 bullet holes through his chest, and I was stunned. I thought, miracles, wow. And you know, we girls like to hear about miracles.
Well, you spent a lot of your literary career writing about miracles and visions and that sort of thing.
And I had never heard George Washington mention a miracle, but he wrote a letter to his brother saying he should have been killed. And he stated, divine providence must have a reason for my being alive. So I started my little journey to read and study about George Washington, and the deeper I dug, the more I found there were really no books that looked through the prism of his spirituality. And nowadays, we're all trying to discern what our own spirituality is, what the world's spirituality is, where we come together as a people, and Washington was onto that 200 years ago.
A lot of this material, though, is difficult to come across. I mean, there's that bound collection of his letters to clergymen, but it's rarely seen. I know he, in his own hand, wrote over 100 prayers.
Oh.
Where are those? How did you come
You
across
can find those online in his own handwriting. I was staying at the Cosmos Club here in Washington on a professional meeting in Washington, and a lady came up to me after a dinner and said that she had a book for me that could change my life. And she was staying at one of the embassies. She was from another country. And it was a little book by someone named Johnson, and it had Washington's prayers and his spirituality. I was basically unimpressed with the book, I'm apologizing to say, but I was also very impressed with the deep concern this woman had for the spirituality of George Washington, in that she was a guest in our country. So I traced it back. And in that journey back to this particular biographer, I began to uncover the truth about Washington's incredible spiritual life. It started when he was a little boy, when he lost his father when he was only 11. He watched death. He had very little. He was a poor boy, basically. His mother depended on him to support herself and 5 younger siblings. Then he watched his brother, who married into the Lord Fairfax family, die at a young age, and so he became aware of prayer. He was also very Jesuit educated, which
that I didn't realize.
Well, being Jesuit educated myself, I was stunned because he was trained as a boy by a Reverend Marie, a French Jesuit who was run out of France because of the Revolution, and he came to Virginia and he taught in a school where George Washington was a little boy, and he made him learn the rules of civility, which are steeped in secular language, arrangement of St. Ignatius of Loyola's rules for discernment and rules for healthy living. Washington memorized them, and he really lived by them. And the more you delve into the persona of Washington, if you read, he was an incredible writer. The reason we know so much about him was his pen was dipped in the ink of men's blood, or we wouldn't have had the battles and the Revolutionary War won. He wrote about all of that, and they're all online.
Let's talk for a moment about this prayer book that he assembled, and I guess at like 21, it is believed, he wrote by hand.
Correct.
This daily sacrifice prayer book, which you reprint in this book.
Yes, and it's a treasure. It's such a treasure.
But what does it tell us?
It tells us that it was probably very true, that he truly was the most humble man on earth. King George said when Washington died that George Washington was the most humble man who ever lived on earth. Okay, why? What is humility? What did people see in this leader? So these prayers, if you read them, they touch my heart. Even now, when I have the grace to read them, I bow in shock at how far from the love of Christ I should be, because he was there. And he carried them with him. His family attested and wrote for historians that he did pray them, that he induced them to pray them. So if we have hands-on authentication from his own family, and we have them in his own hands, why should we doubt it?
Tell me about Valley Forge.
Oh, I love that story.
His troops are shoeless. They're in this terrible, frigid moment. A ragtag troop, if there ever was one. Spirits are flagging. It's December of 1777, and General Washington encounters what he calls a beautiful woman. First of all, where does this account come from, and tell us about it?
Oh, it's marvelous. Well, you know Valley Forge was the end. The more astute folks were back in Philadelphia cutting deals with the Brits to go back home or not to be executed as traitors. And there's Washington looking at these starving men in the snow. And so where did I find this data? I was working on a book, Meetings with Mary. And I had done the research on all the foundings of the great nations in Western civilization and the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the founding of the great nations in Western civilization. And I mentioned to my colleague, you know, it doesn't make sense the United States doesn't have something. We are a great Christian nation. Where's our Blessed Mother? Where did she show up here for us? And my friend said, I'll find out. We have the Library of Congress. And within 2 days, she was so excited. She had found her colleague had found a microchip, and we got it printed. And it was the story that's in this book about the apparition at Valley Forge. My husband and I went to Valley Forge to try to discern what days it could have happened. We've identified 4 days in December of that awesome year when it probably happened, and a location where it had to happen. And Washington told his peers, 2 of them, that this beautiful lady from heaven showed up, this celestial lady, accompanied by an angel, and many have called it the angel of the apocalypse. I'm not a theologian, so I can't go there. But she gave him 3 prophetic visions of this country, and she called him Son of the Republic, and she held her hand out, as Our Lady has done in all the great apparitions. Our Lady of Grace, the light coming from her hands, and she had light coming from her hands, and showed him the first scene, which we've already lived, and then the second scene, and then which we've already lived, and then the third scene in which the angel of the angel dipped into the sea and threw this darkness over the whole nation. I pray that's not where we are now. But Our Lady said, I call her Our Lady because it's so Our Lady. Only Our Lady. She has such a history for 2,000 years of helping mankind the same way she did with George Washington. And she said, Son of the Republic, look and learn. As long as you stay together as brothers, you will live as a nation as long as the stars are in the sky. The game is unity, brotherhood.
And how did he interpret this?
Well, from that, I don't know. He spoke only of it once, and we have it right here in this book, his eyewitness account. However, what he did was win the war after that. He shouldn't have won the war. We had nothing. We were lost. The cause was lost. The people were starving. The people had nothing. And from that moment on, miraculously, it turned around, and we went from Valley Forge to Yorktown. Can you believe, if you read what happened at Yorktown, we should not have had that victory either.
It's unbelievable.
It's amazing.
Tell me of his relationship with Archbishop John Carroll.
Oh, I love
the
that.
Carrolls have been haunting the show for the last 3 weeks. We had a relic, well, a relic. It was a Latin primer that the Carrolls, both the Carroll boys, used in England, which folks from Stonyhurst brought a few weeks ago. And then last week, John Carroll came up. So now tell us about the relationship with
This is so
Archbishop
amazing.
Carroll.
All right. Well, George Washington's business partner was Daniel Carroll from Maryland, who signed the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
His brother was Archbishop John Carroll, who had been run out of France at the time of the Revolution because he dared to be a Catholic, a priest, and, oh, by the way, a Jesuit. And here's Washington with his great Jesuit training. So we know from some Jesuits at Georgetown University that George Washington carried an image, could that have been a medal? I don't know, but an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary on his person. We know that he and Daniel Carroll were very close and confidants, and we know that Archbishop Carroll came to care for George Washington the last year of his life when he didn't want the world to know it, but he was a very broken man when he retired back to Mount Vernon. And so Archbishop Carroll came to care for him.
Now, tell me, in the book you talk about the fact that he had a sacramental death.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, I learned from Father Paul Chaffee, the late Father Paul Chaffee at Georgetown, that the Maryland province has the data, the affidavit from a Father Neal, who happened to be on horseback in the area of Mount Vernon on the day that George Washington was dying. And apparently the people were sent out to look for his rector, or his Episcopal, they weren't called Episcopal, they were called Anglican priests, for the Anglican priest who wasn't to be found, but they found Father Neal. And in those days, you have to realize the Anglican priests had valid but illicit ordination, so they interchanged. I don't know if that was known in Rome, but in the colonies, there's such a scarcity of priests that sacramental life was administered by both. And so Father Neal came and he gave him the last rites and signed an affidavit so that history would have it.
Wow. Why hasn't that been widely reported?
Well, I don't know. Oh, well, maybe, yes, I do. Geopolitically, it probably was a good idea not to let the world know too much about that, in that Catholics were deeply persecuted in those days.
Now, I have read a number of biographies that say George Washington, and there is and I went and pulled a book last night knowing you'd be coming on. His priest, James Abercrombie, attests in a number of these biographies that George Washington never took communion in the Anglican Church, or didn't in his parish anyway. He would do a communion call, even gave a sermon encouraging people to come forward. George Washington left the room.
Okay, I do know George Washington did take communion up until the Revolutionary War, after which he always went to worship, but he did not stay for communion.
Why not?
Well, I've thought about that a lot. In those days, people were only allowed to receive the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist 4 times a year. Most people realized how unworthy they were. It was a time when people really believed it was the true presence of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he may have truly felt unworthy to receive the Eucharist.
This book has been quite influential in that it's affected other books since the initial publishing of this work.
Well, with the grace of God, but more interestingly, it's been used to help our troops. Our son was in the Navy at the time of the Battle of Fallujah, and this book was my contribution to 9/11, if you will. And so our son, being a Navy doctor, made sure he could get, his dad was wise enough to be able to get him enough copies that he could give them to the doctors in the triage units, because our people were so badly injured that they needed some kind of courage, some kind of ideal, some hero icon to look up to in these miserable times. And so I had that great blessing of our son using it to help the morale. And secondly, when President Bush was giving Purple Hearts to our troops from Walter Reed Hospital, I had the privilege of being at the Pentagon and being given the honor of giving each of our troops who had received the Purple Heart a book. And I must tell you, as I gave it to them and said, thank you for your service, I saw their wounded prosthesis take a book, and every one of them said, it's a privilege to serve, ma'am. And as the line, the queue went through, maybe 100 or so, the tears, I was watering this book with my tears of gratitude for what our troops do to give us freedom. And I know Washington said his life was a miracle. He always fought at the front of the line, not in the back.
Oh, that was interesting.
He was 6'4" when the average man was 5'7".
And on a white horse, no
on a
less.
big white horse, and there he was, and so Providence spared him. He didn't want to be president of the United States. He was a farmer. He didn't want to be the president of the Constitutional Convention. Raymond, do you know how he led at the Constitutional Convention? By prayer. We had men from all 13 colonies, and everyone had their agenda, and everyone wanted what they wanted. And Washington sat and listened, and as the men watched him, because they knew he had the gift of wisdom, and if Washington was interested in what someone said from Rhode Island, they all looked and listened. If someone from Rhode Island, I'll take any state, or from Maine, or, well, let's not go Maine, let's say Massachusetts wanted too much for the fishermen or whatever, and Washington looked away, it was over, because everyone else started to shuffle and move. And so by his wisdom and by his attention, he brought consensus. And that's how we got a Constitution.
The indispensable man. Thank you for bringing him to us. The Spiritual Journey of George Washington by Janice Connell is available once again in paperback at bookstores everywhere, online, and at EWTN's Religious Catalog. When we return